Welcome back to bedtime with Fall Asleep Fast. Today, we're reading some of the more notable responses to the bombing of Pearl Harbor, including from America, Japan, Australia, the United Kingdom, Germany, and if you like my voice and you'd like to hear more of it, then just click that little subscribe button down below. Sorry to bother you with all that. Now, let's move into our first speech for the night. Eleanor Roosevelt's radio address, December 7th, 1941. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am speaking to you tonight at a very serious moment in our history. The cabinet is convening, and the leaders in Congress are meeting with the President. The State Department and Army and Navy officials have been with the President all afternoon. In fact, the Japanese ambassador was talking to the President at the very time that Japan's airships were bombing our citizens in Hawaii and the Philippines and sinking one of our transports loaded with lumber on its way to Hawaii. By tomorrow morning, the members of Congress will have a full report and be ready for action. In the meantime, we the people are already prepared for action. For months now, the knowledge that something of this kind might happen has been hanging over our heads, and yet it seemed impossible to believe. Impossible to drop the everyday things of life and feel that there was only one thing which was important: preparation to meet an enemy no matter where he struck. That is all over now, and there is no more uncertainty. We know what we have to face, and we know that we are ready to face it. I should like to say just a word to the women in the country tonight. I have a boy at sea on a destroyer. For all I know, he may be on his way to the Pacific. 2 of my children are in coast cities on the Pacific. Many of you all over the countries have boys in the services who will now be called upon to go into action. You have friends and families in what has suddenly become a danger zone. You cannot escape anxiety. You cannot escape a clutch of fear at your heart. And yet, I hope that the certainty of what we have to meet will make you rise above these fears. We must go about our daily business more determined than ever to do the ordinary things as well as we can. And when we find a way to do anything more in our communities to help others, to build morale, to give a feeling of security, we must do it. Whatever is asked of us, I am sure we can accomplish it. We are the free and unconquerable people of the United States of America. To the young people of the nation, I must speak a word tonight. You are going to have a great opportunity. There will be high moments in which your strength and your ability will be tested. I have faith in you. I feel as though I was standing upon a rock, and that rock is my faith in my fellow citizens. Next speech. Franklin D. Roosevelt's War Message, a date which will live in infamy. Addressed to the Congress, asking that a state of war be declared between the United States and Japan, December 8, 1941. Mr. Vice President and Mr. Speaker and members of the Senate and House of Representatives. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with that nation, and at the solicitation of Japan was still in conversation with its government and its emperor, looking toward the maintenance of peace in the Pacific. Indeed, 1 hour after Japanese air squadrons had commenced bombing in the American island of Oahu, the Japanese ambassador to the United States and his colleague delivered to our Secretary of State a formal reply to a recent American message. And while this reply stated that it seemed useless to continue the existing diplomatic negotiations, it contained no threat or hint of war or of an armed attack. It will be recorded that the distance of Hawaii from Japan makes it obvious that the attack was deliberately planned many days or even weeks ago. During the intervening time, the Japanese government has deliberately sought to deceive the United States by false statements and expressions of hope for continued peace. The attack yesterday on the Hawaiian Islands has caused severe damage to American naval and military forces. I regret to tell you that very many American lives have been lost. In addition, American ships have been reported torpedoed on the high seas between San Francisco and Honolulu. Yesterday, the Japanese government also launched an attack against Malaya. Last night, Japanese forces attacked Hong Kong. Last night, Japanese forces attacked Guam. Last night, Japanese forces attacked the Philippine Islands. Last night, the Japanese attacked Wake Island. And this morning, the Japanese attacked Midway Island. Japan has, therefore, undertaken a surprise offensive extending throughout the Pacific area. The facts of yesterday and today speak for themselves. The people of the United States have already formed their opinions and well understand the implications to the very life and safety of our nation. As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, I have directed that all measures be taken for our defense. But always will our whole nation remember the character of the onslaught against us. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory. I believe that I interpret the will of the Congress and of the people when I assert that we will not only defend ourselves to the uttermost, but will make it very certain that this form of treachery shall never again endanger us. Hostilities exist. There is no blinking at the fact that our people, our territory, and our interests are in grave danger. With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God. I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire. Next speech, given by Emperor Hirohito of Japan. The declaration of war against the United States and Britain, given in Tokyo, in Japan, on December 8th, 1941. We, by grace of heaven, Emperor of Japan, seated on the throne of a line unbroken for ages eternal, enjoin upon ye, our loyal and brave subjects. We hereby declare war on the United States of America and the British Empire. The men and officers of our Army and Navy shall do their utmost in prosecuting the war. Our public servants of various departments shall perform faithfully and diligently their appointed tasks, and all other subjects of ours shall pursue their respective duties. The entire nation, with a united will, shall mobilize their total strength, so that nothing will miscarry in the attainment of our war aims. To ensure the stability of East Asia and to contribute to world peace is the far-sighted policy which was formulated by our great, illustrious imperial grandsire and our great imperial sire succeeding him, and which we lay constantly to heart. To cultivate friendship among nations and to enjoy prosperity in common with all nations has always been the guiding principle of our empire's foreign policy. It has been truly unavoidable and far from our wishes that our empire has now been brought to cross swords with America and Britain. More than 4 years have passed since China, failing to comprehend the true intentions of our empire and recklessly courting trouble, disturbed the peace of East Asia and compelled our empire to take up arms. Although there has been re-established the national government of China, with which Japan has effected neighborly intercourse and cooperation, the regime which has survived at Chongqing, relying upon American and British protection, still continues its fratricidal opposition, eager for the realization of their inordinate ambition to dominate the Orient. Both America and Britain, giving support to the Chongqing regime, have aggravated the disturbances in East Asia. Moreover, these two powers, inducing other countries to follow suit, increased military preparations on all sides of our empire to challenge us. They have obstructed by every means our peaceful commerce, and finally resorted to a direct severance of economic relations, menacing gravely the existence of our empire. Patiently have we waited, and long have we endured, in the hope that our government might retrieve the situation in peace. But our adversaries, showing not the least spirit of conciliation, have unduly delayed a settlement, and in the meantime they have intensified the economic and political pressure to compel thereby our empire to submission. This trend of affairs would, if left unchecked, not only nullify our empire's efforts of many years for the sake of the stabilization of East Asia, but also endanger the very existence of our nation. The situation being such as it is, our empire for its existence and self-defense has no other recourse but to appeal to arms and to crush every obstacle in its path. The hallowed spirits of our imperial ancestors guarding us from above, we rely upon the loyalty and courage of our subjects in our confident expectation that the task bequeathed by our forefathers will be carried forward, and that the sources of evil will be speedily eradicated and an enduring peace immutably established in East Asia, preserving thereby the glory of our empire. Next speech by John Curtin, Prime Minister of Australia. Announcement that Australia is at war with Japan on December 8th, 1941. Men and women of Australia, we are at war with Japan. That has happened because, in the first instance, Japanese naval and air forces launched an unprovoked attack on British and United States territory, because our vital interests are imperiled, and because the rights of free people in the whole Pacific are assailed. As a result, the Australian government this afternoon took the necessary steps, which will mean that a state of war exists between Australia and Japan. Tomorrow, in common with the United Kingdom, the United States of America, and the Netherlands East Indies governments, the Australian government will formally and solemnly declare the state of war it has striven so sincerely and strenuously to avoid. Throughout the whole affair, and despite discouragement, the Australian government and its representatives abroad struggled hard to prevent a breakdown of discussions. Australia encouraged the United States to retain the diplomatic initiative on behalf of the democratic powers, We did not want war in the Pacific. The Australian government has repeatedly made it clear, as have the governments of the United Kingdom, the United States, and the Netherlands East Indies, that if war came to the Pacific, it would be of Japan's making. Japan has now made war. I point out that the hands of the democracies are clean. The discussions and negotiations which have taken place between Japan and the democracies were not merely empty bandying the words on the democracies' part. Since last February, it has been the constant aim and endeavor of the democracies to keep peace in the Pacific. It has been a problem fraught with grave difficulties, but in the view of the democracies, it was a problem that was capable of being overcome. Accordingly, the best brains of the democracies were brought to bear on the problem. It will stand on record that the President of the United States himself, the American Secretary of State, Mr. Cordell Hull, the British and Dominion governments worked untiringly and unceasingly. Yet, when the President of the United States had decided to communicate direct to the Japanese Emperor a personal appeal for imperial intervention on the side of peace, the war government of Japan struck. That war government, set on aggression and lusting for power in the same fashion as its Axis partners, anticipated the undoubted weight of the President's plea and shattered the century-old friendship between the two countries. For the first time in the history of the Pacific, armed conflict stalks abroad. No other country but Japan desired war in the Pacific. The guilt for plunging this hemisphere into actual warfare is, therefore, upon Japan. The recapitulation of events I have given you is necessary so that we in Australia may correctly assess the issues involved. The stern truth is that war has been forced upon us, not because of stubborn resistance on the part of the democracies to every demand that Japan made, but because Japan chose the method of armed might to settle differences which every other country involved was ready and willing to settle by negotiation and arbitration. By so doing, Japan chose the Hitler method. While its diplomatic representatives were actually at the White House, while all the democratic powers regarded the conversations as continuing, Japan ignored the convention of a formal declaration of war and struck like an assassin in the night. For, as the dawn broke this morning, at places as far apart as Honolulu, Nauru, Ocean Island, Guam, Singapore, and British Malaya, guns from Japanese warships, bombs from Japanese aircraft, shots from Japanese military forces struck death to United States citizens and members of its defense forces, to the peaceful subjects of Great Britain and her men on ships and on the land. The Pacific Ocean was reddened with the blood of Japanese victims. These wanton killings will be followed by attacks on the Netherlands East Indies, on the Commonwealth of Australia, on the Dominion of New Zealand, if Japan can get its brutal way. Australia, therefore, being a nation that believes in a way of life which has freedom and liberty as its cornerstones, goes to the battle stations in defense of the free way of living. Our course is clear, our cause is just, as has been the case ever since September 1939, when we stood in the path of Hitlerism and declared that we would stand out to the end against ruthlessness and wanton aggression. I say, then, to the people of Australia, give of your best in the service of the nation. There is a place and part for all of us. Each must take his or her place in the service of the nation, for the nation itself is in peril. This is our darkest hour. let that be fully realized. Our efforts in the past 2 years must be as nothing compared with the efforts we must now put forward. I can give you the assurance that the Australian government is fully prepared. It has been in readiness for whatever eventuality that might arise. And last Friday, the initial steps were taken and fully carried out. From early this morning, the service ministers of the cabinet and the chiefs of the fighting services have done everything that has to be done by them. The war cabinet met and put into effect the plan devised for our protection. This afternoon, the full cabinet met, and I am able to announce to you prompt decisions on a wide variety of matters, all of them vital to the new war organization that confronts us. All leave for members of the fighting forces has been cancelled. An extension of the present partial mobilization of Navy, Army, and Air Forces is being prepared. The Minister for Home Security will, tomorrow, confer with Army authorities on air raid precautions. Regulations will be issued to prohibit the consumption of petrol for the purposes of pleasure. A conference will be held by the Minister of Supply with oil companies on the storage of fuel and the security of that storage. Arrangements will be made for all work on services that are essential nationally to be continued on public holidays in future, while, in this connection, all transport service will be concentrated upon necessary purposes. The Minister for Labour will leave for Darwin immediately to organize the labor supply there. An examination will be made to ascertain what retail establishments should continue to trade after 6 p.m. so as to conserve light, coal, transport services. These are some of the things decided upon quickly, but in no atmosphere of panic. There are other things that the government has done. These, by their nature, are secret. But, in total, what has been done today adds up to complete provision for the safety of the nation. Tomorrow, the War Cabinet will meet again, as will the Australian Advisory War Council, when the Leader of the Opposition and his colleagues will be fully appraised of every phase of the position. The Parliament of the Commonwealth will assemble on Tuesday of next week. One thing remains, and on it depends our very lives. This thing is the cooperation, the strength, and the willpower of you, the people of the Commonwealth. Without it, we are indeed lost. Men and women of Australia, the call is to you for your courage, your physical and mental ability, your inflexible determination that we as a nation of free people shall survive. My appeal to you is in the name of Australia, for Australia is the stake in this conflict. The thread of peace has snapped. Only the valor of our fighting forces, backed by the very uttermost of which we are capable in factory and workshop, can knit that thread again into security. Let there be no idle hand. The road of service is ahead. Let us all tread it firmly, victoriously. We here in this spacious land where for more than 150 years peace and security have prevailed, are now called upon to meet the external aggressor. The enemy presses from without. I have said that our forces are at their battle stations. They are not alone. It is true also that Japan is not alone. But, as I speak to you tonight, the United States, Great Britain and her colonies and dominions, which include the Commonwealth of Australia and the Dominion of New Zealand, the Great Federation of Russian Republics, the Netherlands, East Indies, and China, are associated in the common cause of preserving for free man and free women not only their inheritance, but every hope they have of decency and dignity and liberty. We Australians have imperishable traditions. We shall maintain them. We shall vindicate them. We shall hold this country and keep it as a citadel for the British-speaking race and as a place where civilization will persist. Men and women of the Commonwealth of Australia, it is my solemn duty tonight to sound a tocsin. I proclaim a call unto you. I do it in the words of Swinburne. Come forth, be born and live, thou that has helped to give, and light to make man's day of manhood fair, with flight outflying the sphered sun. Hasten thine hour, and halt not till thy work be done. Next speech. The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Winston Churchill, addressing the House of Commons, the 8th of December, 1941. As soon as I heard last night that Japan had attacked the United States, I felt it necessary that Parliament should be immediately summoned. It is indispensable to our system of government that Parliament should play its full part in all the important acts of state and at all the crucial moments of the war, and I am glad to see that so many members have been able to be in their places, despite the shortness of the notice. With the full approval of the nation and of the Empire, I pledged the word of Great Britain about a month ago that should the United States be involved in war with Japan, a British declaration of war would follow within the hour. I, therefore, spoke to President Roosevelt on the Atlantic telephone last night, with a view to arranging the timing of our respective declarations. The President told me he would this morning send a message to Congress, which of course, as is well known, can alone make a declaration of war on behalf of the United States, and I then assured him that we would follow immediately. However, it soon appeared that British territory in Malaya had also been the object of Japanese attack, and later on it was announced from Tokyo that the Japanese High Command, a curious form, not the Imperial Japanese government, had declared that a state of war existed with Great Britain and the United States. That being so, there was no need to wait for the declaration by Congress. American time is very nearly 6 hours behind ours. The Cabinet, therefore, which met at 12:30 today, authorized an immediate declaration of war upon Japan. Instructions were sent to His Majesty's ambassador at Tokyo, and a communication was dispatched to the Japanese chargé d'affaires at 1 o'clock today to this effect. Foreign Office, December 8th. Sir, on the evening of December 7th, His Majesty's government in the United Kingdom learned that Japanese forces, without previous warning, either in the form of a declaration of war or of an ultimatum with a conditional declaration of war, had attempted a landing on the coast of Malaya and bombed Singapore and Hong Kong. In view of these wanton acts of unprovoked aggression, committed in flagrant violation of international law and particularly of Article 1 of the Third Hague Convention relative to the opening of hostilities to which both Japan and the United Kingdom are parties, His Majesty's ambassador at Tokyo has been instructed to inform the Imperial Japanese government, in the name of His Majesty's government in the United Kingdom, that a state of war exists between the two countries. I have the honor to be, with high consideration, Sir, your obedient servant, Winston S. Churchill. Meanwhile, hostilities have already begun.
the Japanese began a landing in British territory in northern Malaya at about 6 o'clock, 1 a.m. local time, yesterday, and they were immediately engaged by our forces, which were in readiness. The Home Office measures against Japanese nationals were set in motion at 10:45 last night. The House will see, therefore, that no time has been lost, and that we are actually ahead of our engagements. The Royal Netherlands government at once marked their solidarity with Great Britain and the United States at 3 o'clock in the morning. The Netherlands Prime Minister informed the Foreign Office that his government were telling the Japanese government that, in view of the hostile acts perpetrated by Japanese forces against two powers with whom the Netherlands maintained particularly close relations, they considered that, as a consequence, a state of war now exists between the Kingdom of the Netherlands and Japan. I do not yet know what part Siam or Thailand will be called upon to play in this fresh war, but a report has reached us that the Japanese have landed troops at Singora, which is in Siamese territory, on the frontier of Malaya, not far from the landing they had made on the British side of the frontier. Meanwhile, just before Japan had gone to war, I had sent the Siamese Prime Minister the following message. It was sent off on Sunday early in the morning. There is a possibility of imminent Japanese invasion of your country. If you are attacked, defend yourself. The preservation of the full independence and sovereignty of Thailand is a British interest, and we shall regard an attack on you as an attack on ourselves. It is worthwhile looking for a moment at the manner in which the Japanese have begun their assault upon the English-speaking world. Every circumstance of calculated and characteristic Japanese treachery was employed against the United States. The Japanese envoys, Nomura and Kurusu, were ordered to prolong their mission in the United States in order to keep the conversations going while a surprise attack was being prepared, to be made before a declaration of war could be delivered. The President's appeal to the Emperor, which I have no doubt many members will have read, it has been published largely in the papers here, reminding him of their ancient friendship and the importance of preserving the peace of the Pacific, has received only this base and brutal reply. No one can doubt that every effort to bring about a peaceful solution had been made by the government of the United States, and that immense patience and composure had been shown in face of the growing Japanese menace. Now that the issue is joined in the most direct manner, it only remains for the two great democracies to face their task with whatever strength God may give them. We must hold ourselves very fortunate, and I think we may rate our affairs not wholly ill-guided, that we were not attacked alone by Japan in our period of weakness after Dunkirk, or at any time in 1940, before the United States had fully realized the dangers which threatened the whole world, and had made much advance in its military preparation. So precarious and narrow was the margin upon which we then lived that we did not dare to express the sympathy which we have all along felt for the heroic people of China. We were even forced, for a short time in the summer of 1940, to agree to closing the Burma Road. But later on, at the beginning of this year, as soon as we could regather our strength, we reversed that policy. And the House will remember that both I and the Foreign Secretary have felt able to make increasingly outspoken declarations of friendship for the Chinese people and their great leader, General Chiang Kai-shek. We have always been friends. Last night, I cabled to the Generalissimo assuring him that henceforward we would face the common foe together. Although the imperative demands of the war in Europe and in Africa have strained our resources, vast and growing though they are, the House and the Empire will notice that some of the finest ships in the Royal Navy have reached their stations in the Far East at a very convenient moment. Every preparation in our power has been made, and I do not doubt that we shall give a good account of ourselves. The closest accord has been established with the powerful American forces, both naval and air, and also with the strong, efficient forces belonging to the Royal Netherlands government in the Netherlands East Indies. We shall all do our best. When we think of the insane ambition and insatiable appetite which have caused this vast and melancholy extension of the war, we can only feel that Hitler's madness has infected the Japanese mind, and that the root of the evil and its branch must be extirpated together. It is of the highest importance that there should be no underrating of the gravity of the new dangers we have to meet, either here or in the United States. The enemy has attacked with an audacity which may spring from recklessness, but which may also spring from a conviction of strength. The ordeal to which the English-speaking world and our heroic Russian allies are being exposed will certainly be hard, especially at the outset, and will probably be long. Yet when we look around us over the somber panorama of the world, we have no reason to doubt the justice of our cause, or that our strength and willpower will be sufficient to sustain it. We have at least 4/5 of the population of the globe upon our side. We are responsible for their safety and for their future. In the past we have had a light which flickered, in the present we have a light which flames, and in the future there will be a light which shines over all the land and sea.
Next speech. Adolf Hitler addressing the German Reichstag in his speech declaring war against the United States in the aftermath of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. December 11th, 1941. And just to make you aware, this is an incredibly long speech in comparison to the others, as was characteristic of Hitler. Deputies, men of the German Reichstag, a year of events of historical significance is drawing to an end. A year of the greatest decisions lies ahead. In these serious times, I speak to you, deputies of the German Reichstag, as to the representatives of the German nation. Beyond and above that, the whole German people should take note of this glance into the past, as well as of the coming decisions the present and future impose upon us. After the renewed refusal of my peace offer in January 1940 by the then British Prime Minister and the clique which supported or else dominated him, it became clear that this war against all reasons of common sense and necessity must be fought to its end. You know me, my old party companions. You know I have always been an enemy of half measures or weak decisions. If the Providence has so willed that the German people cannot be spared this fight, then I can only be grateful that it entrusted me with the leadership in this historic struggle which, for the next 500 or 1,000 years, will be described as decisive, not only for the history of Germany but for the whole of Europe, and indeed the whole world. The German people and their soldiers are working and fighting today not only for the present but for the coming, nay, the most distant generations. A historical revision on a unique scale has been imposed on us by the Creator. Shortly after the end of the campaign in Norway, the German command was forced, first of all, to ensure the military security of the conquered areas. Since then, the defenses of the conquered countries have changed considerably. From Kirkenes to the Spanish frontier, there is a belt of great bases and fortifications. Many airfields have been built, naval bases and protections for submarines which are practically invulnerable from sea or air. More than 1,500 new batteries have been planned and constructed. A network of roads and railways was constructed so that today communications from the Spanish frontier to Petsamo are independent of the sea. These installations in no wise fall behind those of the Western Wall, and work continues incessantly on strengthening them. I am irrevocably determined to make the European front unassailable by any enemy. This defensive work was supplemented by offensive warfare. German surface and underwater naval forces carried on their constant war of attrition against the British merchant navy and the ships in its service. The German Air Force supported these attacks by reconnaissance, by damaging enemy shipping, by numerous retaliatory raids which have given the English a better idea of the so charming war caused by their present Prime Minister. In the middle of last year, Germany was supported above all by Italy. For many months, a great part of British power weighed on the shoulders of Italy. Only because of their tremendous superiority in heavy tanks could the English create a temporary crisis in North Africa. On 24th of March, a small community of German-Italian units under Rommel's command began the counterattack, dates on which certain points fell. The German Africa Corps performed outstanding achievements, though they were completely unaccustomed to the climate of this theater of war. Just as once in Spain, now in North Africa, Germans and Italians have taken up arms against the same enemy. While in these bold measures, the North African front was again secured by the blood of German and Italian soldiers. The shadow of a terrible danger threatening Europe gathered overhead. Only in obedience to bitter necessity did I decide in my heart in 1939 to make the attempt, at least, to create the prerequisites for a lasting peace in Europe by eliminating the causes of German-Russian tension. This was psychologically difficult, owing to the general attitude of the German people, and above all, of the party, towards Bolshevism. It was not difficult from a purely material point of view because Germany was only intent on her economic interests in all the territories which England declared to be threatened by us, and which she attacked with her promises of aid. For you will allow me to remind you that England, through the spring and late summer of 1939, offered its aid to numerous countries, declaring that it was our intention to invade those countries and thus deprive them of their liberty. The German Reich and its government were therefore able to affirm with a clear conscience that these allegations were false and had no bearing whatsoever on reality. Add to this the military realization that in case of war, which British diplomacy was to force on the German people, a two-front war would ensue and call for a very great sacrifice. When, on top of all this, the Baltic states and Romania showed themselves prone to accept the British pacts of assistance and thus let it be seen that they too believed in such a threat, it was not only the right of the Reich government, but its duty to fix the limits of German interests. The countries in question, and above all, the Reich government, could not but realize that the only factor which could be a buttress against the East was Germany. The moment they severed their connection with the German Reich and entrusted their fate to the aid of that power which in its proverbial selfishness has never rendered aid, but always requested it, they were lost. Yet the fate of these countries roused the sympathy of the German people. The winter struggle of the Finns forced on us a feeling mixed with bitterness and admiration. Admiration because we have a heart sensitive to sacrifice and heroism, being a nation of soldiers ourselves. Bitterness because with our eyes fixed on the menacing enemy in the west and on the danger in the east, we were not in a position to render military assistance. As soon as it became evident that Soviet Russia deduced the right to wipe out the nations living outside the limits of the German sphere of interest, as a result of that limitation of interests, our subsequent relations were merely governed by utilitarian considerations, while our reason and feelings were hostile. With every month, I became more convinced that the plans of the men in Kremlin aimed at domination and annihilating all Europe. I have had to submit to the nation the full extent of the Russian military preparations. at a time when Germany had only a few divisions in the provinces bordering on Russia, it would have been evident to a blind man that a concentration of power of singular and world historic dimensions was taking place, and that, not in order to defend something which was threatened, but merely in order to attack an object it did not seem possible to defend. The lightning conclusion of the Western campaign, however, robbed the Moscow overlords of their hope of an early flagging of German power. This did not alter their intentions, it merely led to a postponement of the date on which they intended to strike. In the summer of 1941, they thought the time was ripe. A new Mongolian storm was now to sweep Europe. At the same time, however, Mr. Churchill spoke on the English aspect of the struggle with Germany. He saw fit, in a cowardly manner, to deny that in the secret session of 1940 in the House of Commons that he pointed out that the entry of Russians into the war, which was to come in 1941 at the very latest, was the most important factor which would make a successful conclusion of the war possible. This was also to enable England to take the offensive. In the spring of that year, Europe was to feel the full extent of the might of a world power which seemed to dispose of inexhaustible human material and resources. Dark clouds began to gather on the European sky. For, my deputies, what is Europe? There is no fitting geographical definition of our continent, but only a national and cultural one. Not the Urals form the frontier of our continent, but the entire line which divides the eastern and western conceptions of life. There was a time when Europe was that Greek island into which Nordic tribes had penetrated in order to light a torch for the first time. From then onwards began slowly but surely to brighten the world of man. When these Greeks repulsed the invasion of the Persian conquerors, they did not only defend their homeland, which was Greece, but the idea which we call Europe today. And then Europe traveled from Hellas to Rome. With the Greek spirit and Greek culture, the Roman way of thinking and Roman statesmanship were joined. An empire was created which, to this day, has not been equaled in its significance and creative power, let alone outdone. When, however, the Roman legions were defending Rome against the African onslaught of Carthage, and at last gained a victory, again it was not Rome they were fighting for, but the Europe of that time, which consisted of the Greek-Roman world. The next incursion against this homestead of European culture was carried out from the distant east. A terrible stream of barbarous, uncultured hordes sallied forth from the interior of Asia deep into the heart of the European continent, burning, looting, murdering, a true scourge of the Lord. In the Battle of the Catalonian Fields, the West was formed. On the ruins of Rome, the West was built, and its defense was a task not only of the Romans, but also above all of the Teutons, Germans. In centuries to come, the West, enlightened by Greek culture, built the Roman Empire, and then expanded by the colonization of the Teutons, was able to call itself Europe. Whether it was the German emperor who was repelling the attacks from the east on the field of Lech, or whether Africa was being pushed back from Spain in long fighting, it was also a struggle of Europe coming into being against a surrounding world alien in its very essence. Once Rome had been given its due for the creative defense of this continent, Teutons took over the defense and the protection of a family of nations which might still differentiate and differ in their political structure and objective, but which nevertheless represented a cultural unity with blood ties. And it was from this Europe that a spiritual and cultural abundance went out, of which everyone must be aware who is willing to seek truth instead of denying it. Thus, it was not England who brought culture to the continent, but the offspring of Teutonic nationhood on the continent, who went as Anglo-Saxons and Normans to that island, made possible a development in a way surely unique. In just the same way, it was not America who discovered Europe, but the other way around. And everything which America has not drawn from Europe may well appear worthy of admiration to a Judaized mixed race. Europe, on the other hand, sees it as a sign of cultural decay. deputies and men of the German Reichstag. I had to make this survey for the fight which in the first months of this year gradually began to become clear, and of which the German Reich is this time called to be the leader also far exceeds the interests of our nation and country. Just as the Greeks once faced the Persians in war and the Romans faced the Mongolians, the Spanish heroes defended not only Spain but the whole of Europe against Africa. Just so, Germany is fighting today not for herself, but for the entire continent. And it is a fortunate symptom that this realization is today so deep in the subconscious of most European nations that, whether by taking up their position openly or whether by the stream of volunteers, they are sharing in this struggle. When, on the 6th of April this year, the German and Italian armies took up their positions for the fight against Yugoslavia and Greece, it was the introduction of the great struggle in which we are still involved. The revolt in Belgrade, which led to the overthrow of the former regent and his government, was decisive for the further course of events in this part of Europe, for England was also a party to this putsch. But the chief role was played by Soviet Russia. What I refused to Mr. Molotov on his visit to Berlin, Stalin now thought he could achieve by a revolutionary movement, even against our will. Without consideration for the agreements which had been concluded, the intentions of the Bolsheviks in power grew still wider. The pact of friendship with the new revolutionary regime illuminated the closeness of the threatening danger like lightning. The feats achieved by the German armed forces were given worthy recognition in the German Reichstag on the 4th of May. But what I was then unfortunately unable to express was the realization that we were progressing at tremendous speed toward a fight with a state which was not yet intervening because it was not yet fully prepared, and because it was impossible to use the aerodromes and landing grounds at that time of year on account of the melting snow. My deputies, when in 1940 I realized from communication in the English House of Commons and the observation of the Russian troop movements on our frontiers that there was the possibility of danger arising in the east of the Reich, I immediately gave orders to set up numerous new armored motorized infantry divisions. The conditions for this were available from the point of view both of material and personnel. I will give you, my deputies, and indeed the whole German people, only one assurance. The more the democracies speak much about armaments, as is easily understandable, the more National Socialist Germany works. It was so in the past. It is not different today. Every year brings us increased and, above all, improved weapons there where decisions will be made. In spite of my determination under no circumstances to allow our opponent to make the first stab in our heart, in spite of that, my decision was a very difficult one. If democratic newspapers today declare that, had I known the strength of our Bolshevik opponent more accurately, I would have hesitated to attack, they understand the position just as little as they understand me. I sought no war. On the contrary, I did everything to avoid it. But I would have been forgetful of my duty and responsibility if, in spite of realizing the inevitability of a fight by force of arms, I had failed to draw the only possible conclusions. In view of the mortal danger from Soviet Russia, not only to the German Reich, but to all Europe, I decided, if possible, a few days before the outbreak of this more struggle, to give the signal to attack myself. Today we have overwhelming and authentic proof that Russia intended to attack. We are also quite clear about the date on which the attack was to take place. In view of the great danger, the proportions of which we realize perhaps only today to the fullest extent, I can only thank God that He enlightened me at the proper time and that He gave me the strength to do what had to be done. To this, not only millions of German soldiers owe their lives, but Europe its very existence. This much I may state today. Had this wave of over 20,000 tanks, hundreds of divisions, tens of thousands of guns, accompanied by more than 10,000 aircraft, suddenly moved against the Reich, Europe would have been lost. Fate has destined a number of nations to forestall this attack, to ward it off with the sacrifice of their blood. Had Finland not decided immediately to take up arms for the second time, the leisurely bourgeois life of the other Nordic countries would soon have come to an end. Had the German Reich not faced the enemy with her soldiers and arms, a flood would have swept over Europe, which once and for all would have finished the ridiculous British idea of maintaining the European balance of power in all its senselessness and stupid tradition. Had Slovaks, Hungarians, Romanians not taken over part of the protection of this European world, the Bolshevik hordes would have swept like Attila's Huns over the Danubian countries, and at the cost of the Ionic Sea, Tartars and Mongols, would have enforced today the revision of the Montreux Agreement. Had Italy, Spain and Croatia not sent their divisions, the establishment of a European defense front would have been impossible, from which emanated the idea of the new Europe as propaganda to all other nations. Sensing and realizing this, the volunteers have come from Northern and Western Europe, Norwegians, Danes, Dutchmen, Flemings, Belgians, even Frenchmen, volunteers who gave the struggle of the United Powers of the Axis the character of a European crusade, in the truest sense of the word. The time has not yet come to talk about the planning and the conduct of this campaign, but I believe that I may sketch in a few sentences what has been achieved in this most gigantic of all struggles, in which memories of the various impressions might so easily fade because of the vastness of the space and the great number of important events. The attack began on 22nd of June, with irresistible daring. The frontier fortifications which were destined to secure the Russian advance against us were broken through, and on the 23rd Grodno fell. On the 24th Vilna and Kovu were taken after Brest-Litovsk had been occupied. On the 26th Duanaburg was in our hands, and on 10th of July the first two great pincer battles of Bialystok and Minsk were concluded. 324,000 prisoners, 3,332 tanks, and 1,809 guns fell to us. Already on 13th of July, the Stalin line was broken through on all important points. On the 16th, Smolensk fell after heavy fighting, and on the 19th, German and Romanian formations forced the crossing of the Dniester. On the 6th of August, the Battle of Smolensk was concluded in many pockets, and again 310,000 Russians fell into German captivity, while 3,205 tanks and 3,120 guns were destroyed or captured. Only 3 days later, the fate of another Russian army group was sealed, and on the 9th of August, another 103,000 Russians were taken prisoner in the Battle of Oman. 317 tanks and 1,100 guns destroyed or captured. On 17th of August, Nikolaev was taken. On the 21st, Kherson. On the same day, the Battle of Gomel was concluded with 84,000 prisoners taken and 124 tanks, as well as 808 guns captured or destroyed. On the 21st of August, the Russian positions between Lakes Peipus and Ilman were broken through, and on the 26th, the bridgehead at Dnipropetrovsk fell into our hands. On the 28th of August, German troops marched into Revel and Baltisk port after heavy fighting, while on the 30th, the Finns took Viipuri. By conquering Schlüsselburg on the 8th of September, Leningrad was finally cut off, also from the south. On 6th of September, we succeeded in establishing bridgeheads on the Dnieper, and on the 8th, Poltava fell into our hands. On 9th of September, German formations stormed the citadel of Kiev, and the occupation of Ursel was crowned by taking the capital. Only now the greatest operations matured into the expected successes. On 27th of September, the Battle of Kiev was concluded. 665,000 prisoners began to move westwards. 884 tanks and 3,178 guns remained as booty in the pockets. As early as 2nd of October, the breakthrough battle on the Central Front began, while on 11th of October the battle on the Sea of Azov was successfully concluded. Again, 107,000 prisoners, 212 tanks, and 672 guns were counted. On 16th of October, German and Romanian troops marched into Odessa after hard fighting. On 8th of October, the breakthrough battle on the Central Front was concluded with a new success, unique in history, when 663,000 prisoners were only part of its results. 1,242 tanks and 5,452 guns were either destroyed or captured. On 31st of October, the conquest of Dagu was concluded. On 24th of October, the industrial center of Kharkov was taken. On 28th of October, the entrance of the Crimea was finally forced at great speed, and on 2nd of November, already the capital Simferopol was taken by storm. On 6th of November, we had pierced through the Crimea up to Kerch. On 1st of December, the total number of Soviet prisoners amounted to 3,806,865. The number of tanks destroyed or captured was 21,391, that of guns 32,541, and that of aeroplanes 17,322. During the same period, 2,191 British planes were shot down. The Navy sank 4,170,611 GRT of British shipping. The Air Force, 2,346,080 GRT. A total of 6,516,791 GRT was thus destroyed. Note: figures checked, as they do not tally. My deputies, my German people, those are sober facts, or perhaps dry figures. Yet may they never disappear from the history, and above all from the memory and the consciousness of our own German people. For behind those figures are hidden the achievements, the sacrifices, the privations, the everlasting heroic courage, and the readiness to die of millions of the best men of our own nation and of the states allied to us. All this had to be fought for by my staking health and life, and by effort of which those at home can hardly have an idea. Marching for an endless distance, tormented by heat and thirst, often held up by the mud of bottomless roads which would drive them almost to despair, exposed from the Black Sea to the Arctic Sea to the inhospitability of a climate from which the blazing heat of the July and August days dropped to the wintry storms of November and December, tortured by insects, suffering from dirt and vermin, freezing in snow and ice, they have fought, the Germans and the Finns, Italians, Slovaks, Hungarians and Romanians, the Croats, the volunteers from the North and West European countries, all in all, soldiers of the Eastern Front. The beginning of winter only will now check this movement. At the beginning of summer, it will again no longer be possible to stop the movement. On this day, I do not want to mention any individual section of the armed forces. I do not want to praise any particular command. They have all made a supreme effort. And yet, understanding and justice compel me to state one thing again and again. Amongst our German soldiers, the heaviest burden is borne today, as in the past, by our matchless German infantry. From 22nd of June to 1st of December, the German army lost in this heroic fight 158,773 killed, 563,082 wounded, and 31,191 missing. The Air Force lost 3,231 killed, 8,453 wounded, and 2,028 missing. The Navy lost 210 killed, 232 wounded, and 115 missing. The total losses of the armed forces are thus 162,314 killed, 571,767 wounded, and 33,334 missing. Note: the figures for soldiers killed do not tally. That is said, in killed and wounded slightly more than the field of death of the Somme battle, in missing a little less than half those missing at that time, but all fathers and sons of our German people. And now permit me to define my attitude to that other world which has its representative in that man who, while our soldiers are fighting in snow and ice, very tactfully likes to make his chats from the fireside. The man who is the main culprit of this war. When in 1939 the conditions of our national interest in the then Polish state became more and more intolerable, I tried at first to eliminate those intolerable conditions by way of a peaceful settlement. For some time, it seemed as though the Polish government itself had seriously considered to agree to a sensible settlement. I may add that in German proposals nothing was demanded that had not been German property in former times. On the contrary, we renounced very much of what, before the World War, had been German property. You will recall the dramatic development of that time, in which the sufferings of German nationals increased continuously. You, my deputies, are in the best position to gauge the extent of the blood sacrifice if you compare it to the casualties of the present war. The campaign in the East has so far cost the German armed forces about 160,000 killed. But in the midst of peace, more than 62,000 Germans were killed during those months, some under the most cruel tortures. It could hardly be contested that the German Reich had a right to object to such conditions on its frontiers and to demand that they should cease to exist, and that it was entitled to think of its own safety. This could hardly be contested at a time when other countries were seeking elements of their safety even in foreign continents. The problems which had to be overcome were of no territorial significance. Mainly they concerned Danzig and the union with the Reich of the torn-off province, East Prussia. More difficult were the cruel persecutions the Germans were exposed to, in Poland particularly. The other minorities, incidentally, had to suffer a fate hardly less bitter. When in August the attitude of Poland, thanks to the carte blanche guarantee received from England, became still stiffer, the government of the Reich found it necessary to submit for the last time a proposal on the basis of which we were willing to enter into negotiations with Poland, negotiations of which we fully and completely apprised the then British ambassador. I may recall these proposals today. Proposal for the settlement of the problem of the Danzig corridor and of the question of the German-Polish minorities. The situation between the German Reich and Poland has become so strained that any further incident may lead to a clash between the armed forces assembled on both sides. Any peaceful settlement must so be arranged that the events mainly responsible for the existing situation cannot occur again. A situation which has caused a state of tension not only in Eastern Europe but also in other regions. The cause of this situation lies in the impossible frontiers laid down by the Versailles Dictate and the inhuman treatment of the German minorities in Poland. I am now going to read the proposals in question. Hitler then proceeded to read the first 12 points of these proposals. The same goes for the proposals for safeguarding the minorities. This is the offer of an agreement such as could not have been made in a more loyal and magnanimous form by any government other than the National Socialist government of the German Reich. The Polish government at that period refused even as much as to consider this proposal. The question then arises, how could such an unimportant state dare simply to refuse an offer of this nature and furthermore not only indulge in further atrocities to its German inhabitants, who had given that country the whole of its culture, but even order mobilization? Perusal of documents of the Foreign Office in Warsaw has given us later some surprising explanations. There was one man who, with devilish lack of conscience, used all his influence to further the warlike intentions of Poland and to eliminate all possibilities of understanding. The reports which the then Polish ambassador in Washington, Count Potocki, sent to his government are documents from which it may be seen with a terrifying clearness to what an extent one man alone, and the forces driving him, are responsible for the Second World War. The question next arises, how could this man fall into such fanatical enmity toward a country which, in the whole of its history, has never done the least harm either to America or to him personally?
Now, just a little aside to you, my listener. I wasn't intending on cutting in here, but just a little word of reassurance. If you've made it this far through and for some reason you're still awake through this very long speech in particular, we are finally at the part where Adolf Hitler starts talking about America in particular. So far as Germany's attitude towards America is concerned, I have to state, 1. Germany is perhaps the only great power which has never had a colony either in North or South America, or otherwise displayed there any political activity, unless mention be made of the emigration of many millions of Germans and of their work, which, however, has only been to the benefit of the American continent and of the USA. 2. In the whole history of the coming into being and of the existence of the USA, the German Reich has never adopted a politically unfriendly, let alone hostile attitude, but, on the contrary, with the blood of many of its sons, it helped to defend the USA. The German Reich never took part in any war against the USA. It itself had war imposed upon it by the USA in 1917, and then for reasons which have been thoroughly revealed by an investigation committee set up by President Roosevelt himself. There are no other differences between the German and the American people, either territorial or political, which could possibly touch the interests, let alone the existence of the USA. There was always a difference of constitution, but that cannot be a reason for hostilities, so long as the one state does not try to interfere with the other. America is a republic, a democracy, and today is a republic under strong authoritative leadership. The ocean lies between the two states. The divergences between capitalist America and Bolshevik Russia, if such conceptions had any truth in them, would be much greater than between America, led by a president, and Germany, led by a Führer. But it is a fact that the two conflicts between Germany and the USA were inspired by the same force and caused by two men in the USA, Wilson and Roosevelt. History has already passed its verdict on Wilson. His name stands for one of the basest breaches of the given word that led to disruption not only among the so-called vanquished, but also among the victors. This breach of his word alone made possible the Dictate of Versailles. We know today that a group of interested financiers stood behind Wilson and made use of this paralytic professor because they hoped for increased business. The German people have had to pay for having believed this man with the collapse of their political and economic existence. But why is there now another president of the USA who regards it as his only task to intensify anti-German feeling to the pitch of war? National Socialism came to power in Germany in the same year as Roosevelt was elected president. I understand only too well that a worldwide distance separates Roosevelt's ideas and my ideas. Roosevelt comes from a rich family and belongs to the class whose path is smoothed in the democracies. I am only the child of a small, poor family and had to fight my way by work and industry. Apologies. When the Great War came, Roosevelt occupied a position where he got to know only its pleasant consequences, enjoyed by those who do business while others bleed. I was only one of those who carry out orders as an ordinary soldier, and naturally returned from the war just as poor as I was in autumn 1914. I shared the fate of millions, and Franklin Roosevelt only the fate of the so-called upper 10,000. After the war, Roosevelt tried his hand at financial speculation. He made profits out of the inflation, out of the misery of others, while I, together with many hundreds of thousands more, lay in hospital. When Roosevelt finally stepped on the political stage with all the advantages of his class, I was unknown and fought for the resurrection of my people.
When Roosevelt took his place at the head of the USA, he was the candidate of a capitalist party which made use of him. When I became Chancellor of the German Reich, I was the Führer of the popular movement I had created. The powers behind Roosevelt were those powers I had fought at home. The Brains Trust was composed of people such as we have fought against in Germany as parasites and removed from public life. I'm sorry, when he says removed from public life, there is something so dark about that. Anyway. And yet there is something in common between us. Roosevelt took over a state in a very poor economic condition, and I took over a Reich faced with complete ruin, also thanks to democracy. In the USA, there were 13 million unemployed, and in Germany 7 million part-time workers. The finances of both states were in a bad way, and ordinary economic life could scarcely be maintained. A development then started in the USA and the German Reich, which will make it easy for posterity to pass a verdict on the correctness of the theories. While an unprecedented revival of economic life, culture, and art took place in Germany under National Socialist leadership within the space of a few years, President Roosevelt did not succeed in bringing about even the slightest improvements in his own country. And yet, this work must have been much easier in the USA, where there live scarcely 15 persons on a square kilometer, as against 140 in Germany. If such a country does not succeed in assuring economic prosperity, this must be a result either of the bad faith of its leaders in power or of a total inefficiency on the part of the leading men. In scarcely 5 years, economic problems had been solved in Germany and unemployment had been overcome. During the same period, President Roosevelt had increased the state debt of his country to an enormous extent, had decreased the value of the dollar, had brought about a further disintegration of economic life without diminishing the unemployment figures. All this is not surprising if one bears in mind that the men he had called to support him, or rather, the men who had called him, belonged to the Jewish element, whose interests are all for disintegration and never for order. While speculation was being fought in National Socialist Germany, it thrived astoundingly under the Roosevelt regime. Roosevelt's New Deal legislation was all wrong. It was actually the biggest failure ever experienced by one man. There can be no doubt that a continuation of this economic policy would have done this president in peacetime, in spite of all his dialectical skill. In a European state, he would surely have come eventually before a state court on a charge of deliberate waste of the national wealth, and he would have scarcely escaped at the hands of a civil court on a charge of criminal business methods. This fact was realized and fully appreciated also by many Americans, including some of high standing. A threatening opposition was gathering over the head of this man. He guessed that the only salvation for him lay in diverting public attention from home to foreign policy. It is interesting to study in this connection the reports of the Polish envoy in Washington, Potocki. He repeatedly points out that Roosevelt was fully aware of the danger threatening the card castle of his economic system with collapse, and that he was therefore urgently in need of a diversion in foreign policy. He was strengthened in his resolve by the Jews around him. Their Old Testament thirst for revenge thought to see in the USA an instrument for preparing a second Purim for the European nations which were becoming increasingly anti-Semitic. The full diabolical meanness of Jewry rallied around this man, and he stretched out his hands. Have I already done a disclaimer about this not being my opinion, only for, well, I wouldn't call it entertainment, but to help you get to sleep? This is not my opinion. Obviously, I don't agree with Hitler about this. Thus began the increasing efforts of the American president to create conflicts, to do everything to prevent conflicts from being peacefully solved,
For years this man harbored one desire, that a conflict should break out somewhere in the world. The most convenient place would be in Europe, where American economy could be committed to the cause of one of the belligerents in such a way that a political interconnection of interests would arise calculated slowly to bring America nearer such a conflict. This would thereby divert public interest from bankrupt economic policy at home towards foreign problems. His attitude to the German Reich in this spirit was particularly sharp. In 1937, Roosevelt made a number of speeches, including a particularly mean one pronounced in Chicago on 5th of October 1937. Systematically, he began to incite American public opinion against Germany. He threatened to establish a kind of quarantine against the so-called authoritarian states. While making these increasingly spiteful and inflammatory speeches, President Roosevelt summoned the American ambassadors to Washington to report to him. This event followed some further declarations of an insulting character, and ever since, the two countries have been connected with each other only through chargé d'affaires. From November 1938 onwards, his systematic efforts were directed towards sabotaging any possibility of an appeasing policy in Europe. In public, he was hypocritically pretending to be for peace, but at the same time he was threatening any country ready to pursue a policy of peaceful understanding with the freezing of assets, with economic reprisals, with demands for the repayment of loans, etc. Staggering information to this effect can be derived from the reports of Polish ambassadors in Washington, London, Paris, and Brussels. My apologies if you are noticing a difference in my voice. It is because we are now at 24 hours later from the recording of everything up until now. The reason for this is because, well, to be honest, I was doing a little bit too much of a good job, and I put myself to sleep about 3 or 4 times during the recording of Hitler's speech in particular. I understand its historical significance, no less than anyone else. I'm a teacher of history and geography in another life. But he is really just using this opportunity, isn't he, to reify his, birthright Germany's birthright as an individual in its own right, as an entity, in taking over the rest of Europe in the name of Europe, before he can then include America on his dirty dog list. So, without further ado, I believe we're just getting into the part where he does start talking a little bit more about the event at hand, Pearl Harbor, and America's new involvement in the war. My apologies for the interruption, like I said. Let's move on. In January 1939, this man began to strengthen his campaign of incitement and threatened to take all possible congressional measures against the authoritarian states, with the exception of war, while alleging that other countries were trying to interfere in American affairs and insisting on the maintenance of the Monroe Doctrine. He himself began from March 1939 onwards to meddle in European affairs which were no concern at all of the President of the USA. Since he does not understand these problems, and even if he did understand them, and the historic background behind them, he would have just as little right to worry about the Central European area as the German Reich has to judge conditions in a US state, and to take an attitude towards them. But Mr. Roosevelt went even farther. In contradiction to all the tenets of international law, he declared that he would not recognize certain governments which did not suit him, would not accept readjustments, would maintain legations of states, dissolved long before or actually set them up as legal governments. He even went so far as to conclude agreements with such envoys, and thus to acquire a right simply to occupy foreign territories. On 5th of April 1939 came Roosevelt's famous appeal to myself and the Deuce. It was a clumsy combination of geographical and political ignorance and of the arrogance of the millionaire circles around him. It asked us to give undertakings to conclude non-aggression pacts indiscriminately with any country, including mostly countries which were not even free, since Mr. Roosevelt's allies had annexed them or changed them into protectorates. You will remember, my deputies, that I then gave a polite and clear reply to this meddling gentleman. For some months at least, this stopped the flow of eloquence from this honest warmonger. But his place was taken by his honorable spouse. She declined to live with her sons in a world such as the one we have worked out. And quite right, for this is a world of labor and not of cheating and trafficking. After a little rest, the husband of that woman came back on the scene and on the 4th of November 1939 engineered the reversion of the neutrality law so as to suspend the ban on the export of arms in favor of a one-sided delivery of arms to Germany's opponents. He then begins, somewhat as in Asia and in China, but the roundabout way of an economic infiltration to establish a community of interests destined to become operative sooner or later. In the same month, he recognizes, as a so-called government in exile, a gang of Polish emigrants whose only political foundation was a few million gold coins taken with them from Warsaw. On the 9th of April, he goes on and he orders the blocking of Norwegian and Danish assets under the lying pretext of placing them beyond the German reach, although he knows perfectly well that the Danish government in its financial administration is not in any way being interfered with, let alone controlled, by Germany. To the various exiled governments recognized by him, the Norwegian is now added. On the 15th of May 1940, he recognizes the Dutch and Belgian émigré governments. This is followed by blocking Dutch and Belgian assets. His true mentality then comes clearly to light in a telegram of 15th of June to the French Prime Minister, Renaud. He advises him that the American government will double its help to France, provided that France continues the war against Germany. So as to give still greater expression to this, his wish for a continuation of the war, he issues a declaration that the American government will not recognize the results of the conquest of territories, i.e. the restoration to Germany of lands which had been stolen from her. I don't need to assure you, members of the Reichstag, that it is a matter of complete indifference to every German government whether the President of the USA recognizes the frontiers of Europe or no, and that this indifference will likewise continue in the future. I merely quote this to illustrate the methodical incitement which has come from this man who speaks hypocritically of peace but always urges to war. But now he is seized with fear that if peace is brought about in Europe, his squandering of billions of money or armaments will be looked upon as plain fraud, since nobody will attack America, and he then himself must provoke this attack upon his country. On the 17th of July 1940, the American president orders the blocking of French assets with a view, as he puts it, to placing them beyond German reach, but really in order to transfer the French gold from Casablanca to America with the assistance of an American cruiser. In July 1940, he tries by enlisting American citizens in the British Air Force and by training British airmen in the USA to pave ever better the way to war. In August 1940, a military program is jointly drawn up between the USA and Canada to make the establishment of a Canadian-US Defense Committee plausible at least to the biggest fools. He invents from time to time crises. by means of which he pretends that America is being threatened with aggression. This he wishes to impress upon the American people by suddenly returning on the 3rd of April to Washington with all speed on account of the alleged danger of the situation. In September 1940, he draws still nearer to the war. He turns over to the British fleet 50 destroyers of the American Navy, in return for which, to be sure, he takes over several British bases in North and South America. From all these actions, it may be clearly seen how, with all his hatred for socialist Germany, he forms the resolution of taking over, as safely and securely as possible, the British Empire in the moment of its downfall. Since England is no longer in the position to pay cash for all the American deliveries, he imposes the lease lend law on the American people. He thus receives powers to lend or lease support to countries, the defense of which may appear to him as vital in America's interests. Then, in 1941, as Germany cannot be made to react to any of his gestures, he takes yet a further step. As far back as the 9th of December 1939, American cruisers in the security zone handed over the German ship Columbus to the British ships. In the circumstances, she had to be sunk, i.e. scuttled. On the same day, U.S. forces cooperated to prevent the attempted escape of the German steamer Hirohito. On the 27th of January 1940, the U.S. cruiser, in contravention of international law, advised enemy naval forces of the movement of the German steamers Hirohito, La Plata, and Mangione. On the 27th of June 1940, he ordered, in complete contravention of international law, a restriction of the freedom of movements of foreign ships in U.S. harbors. In November 1940, he ordered the German ships Ruhigoi, Niederwald, and Rhein to be shadowed by American ships until these steamers were compelled to scuttle themselves so as not to fall into enemy hands. On 30th of April 1941, followed the opening up of the Red Sea to U.S. ships so that they could carry supplies to the British armies in the Near East. Meanwhile, in March, all German ships were requisitioned by the American authorities. In the course of this, German nationals were treated in a most inhuman manner, and in contravention of all notions of international law, certain places of residence were assigned them, traveling restrictions imposed upon them, and so on. 2 German officers, who had escaped from Canadian captivity, were again, contrary to all the dictates of international law, handcuffed and handed over to the Canadian authorities. 24th of March, the same president who stands against every aggression acclaimed Simovic, chief of aviation, Yugoslavia, and his companions who gained their positions by aggression and by removing the lawful government of the country. Roosevelt, some months before, sent Colonel Donovan, a completely unworthy creature, to the Balkans, to Sofia and Belgrade, to engineer a rising against Germany and Italy. In April, he promised to help Yugoslavia and Greece under the Lend-Lease Act. At the end of April, this man recognized the Yugoslav and Greek émigré governments, and once more, against international law, blocked the Yugoslav and Greek assets. From the middle of April onwards, American watch over the western Atlantic by USA patrols was extended, and reports were made to the British. On the 26th of April, Roosevelt transferred to the British 20 motor torpedo boats, and at the same time British warships were being repaired in U.S. ports. On 5th of May, the illegal arming and repairing of Norwegian ships for England took place. On 4th of June, American troop transports arrived in Greenland to build aerodromes. On 9th of June came the first British report that on Roosevelt's orders a U.S. warship had attacked a German U-boat with depth charges near Greenland. On 4th of June, German assets in the USA were illegally blocked. On the 7th of June, Roosevelt demanded under mendacious pretexts that German consuls should be withdrawn and German consulates closed. He also demanded the closing of the German press agency Transocean, the German Information Library, and the German Reichsbank central office. On 6th and 7th of July, Iceland, which is within the German fighting zone, was occupied by American forces on the orders of Roosevelt. He intended, first of all, to force Germany to make war and to make the German U-boat warfare as ineffective as it was in 1915-16. At the same time, he promised American help to the Soviet Union. On 10th of June, the Navy Minister Knox suddenly announced on American order to shoot at Axis warships. On 4th of September, the U.S. destroyer Greer, obeying orders, operated with British aircraft against German U-boats in the Atlantic. 5 days later, a German U-boat noticed the U.S. destroyer acting as escort in a British convoy. On 11th of September, Roosevelt finally made a speech in which he confirmed and repeated his order to fire on all Axis ships. On 29th of September, U.S. escort vessels attacked a German U-boat with depth charges east of Greenland. On 7th of October, the U.S. destroyer Kearney, acting as an escort vessel for Britain, again attacked German U-boats with depth charges. Finally, on 6th of November, U.S. forces illegally seized the German steamer Odenwald and took it to an American port, where the crew were taken prisoner. I will pass over the insulting attacks made by this so-called president against me. That he calls me a gangster is uninteresting. After all, this expression was not coined in Europe, but in America, no doubt because such gangsters are lacking here. Apart from this, I cannot be insulted by Roosevelt, for I consider him mad just as Wilson was. I don't need to mention what this man has done for years in the same way against Japan. First he incites war, then falsifies the causes, then odiously wraps himself in a cloak of Christian hypocrisy, and slowly but surely leads mankind to war, not without calling God to witness the honesty of his attack, in the approved manner of an old Freemason. I think you have all found it a relief that now at last one state has been the first to take the step of protest against his historically unique and shameless ill treatment of truth and of right, of which protest this man has desired and about which he cannot complain. The fact that the Japanese government, which has been negotiating for years with this man, has at last become tired of being mocked by him in such an unworthy way, fills us all, the German people, and I think all other decent people in the world, with deep satisfaction. We have seen what the Jews have done in Soviet Russia. We have made the acquaintance of the Jewish paradise on earth. Millions of German soldiers have been able to see this country where the international Jews have destroyed people and property. The President of the USA ought finally to understand, I say this only because of his limited intellect, that we know that the aim of this struggle is to destroy one state after another. But the present German Reich has nothing more in common with the old Germany, and we, for our part, will now do what this provocateur has been trying to do for so many years. Not only because we are the ally of Japan, but also because Germany and Italy have enough insight and strength to comprehend that in these historic times the existence or non-existence of the nations is being decided, perhaps forever. We clearly see the intention of the rest of the world towards us. They reduced democratic Germany to hunger. They would exterminate our social things of today. When Churchill and Roosevelt state that they want to build up a new social order later on, it is like a hairdresser with a bald head recommending an unfortunate hair restorer. These men, who live in the most socially backward states, have misery and distress enough in their own countries to occupy themselves with the distribution of foodstuffs. As for the German nation, It needs charity neither from Mr. Churchill nor from Mr. Roosevelt, let alone from Mr. Eden. It wants only its rights. It will secure for itself this right to life, even if thousands of Churchills and Roosevelts conspire against it. In the whole history of the German nation, of nearly 2,000 years, it has never been so united as today, and thanks to National Socialism, it will remain united in the future. Probably it has never seen so clearly and rarely been so conscious of its honor. I have therefore arranged for his passports to be handed to the American Chargé d'Affaires today, and the following... And we don't hear the next bit, because people are clapping too hard. As a consequence of the further extension of President Roosevelt's policy, which is aimed at unrestricted world domination and dictatorship, the USA, together with England, have not hesitated from using any means to dispute the rights of the German, Italian, and Japanese nations to the basis of their natural existence. The governments of the USA and of England have therefore resisted, not only now, but also for all time, every just understanding meant to bring about a better new order in the world. Since the beginning of the war, the American President Roosevelt has been guilty of a series of the worst crimes against international law. Illegal seizure of ships and other property of German and Italian nationals were coupled with the threat to and looting of those who were deprived of their liberty by being interned. Roosevelt's ever-increasing attacks finally went so far that he ordered the American Navy to attack everywhere ships under the German and Italian flags, and to sink them. This in gross violation of international law. American ministers boasted of having destroyed German submarines in this criminal way. German and Italian merchant ships were attacked by American cruisers, captured, and their crews imprisoned. With no attempt at any official denial, there has now been revealed in America President Roosevelt's plan by which, at the latest in 1943, Germany and Italy were to be attacked in Europe by military means. In this way, the sincere efforts of Germany and Italy to prevent an extension of the war and to maintain relations with the USA, in spite of the unhearable provocations which have been carried on for years by President Roosevelt, have been frustrated. Germany and Italy have been finally compelled, in view of this and in loyalty to the Tripartite Act, to carry on the struggle against the USA and England jointly and side by side with Japan for the defense and thus for the maintenance of the liberty and independence of their nations and empires. The three powers have therefore concluded the following agreement, which was signed in Berlin today. In their unshakable determination not to lay down arms until the joint war against the USA and England reaches a successful conclusion, the German, Italian, and Japanese governments have agreed on the following points. Article 1. Germany, Italy, and Japan will wage the common war forced upon them by the USA and England, with all the means of power at their disposal, to a victorious conclusion. Article 2. Germany, Italy, and Japan undertake not to include an armistice or peace with the USA or with England without complete mutual understanding. Article 3. Germany, Italy, and Japan will continue the closest cooperation even after the victorious conclusion of the war, in order to bring about a just new order in the sense of the Tripartite Pact concluded by them on the 27th of September 1940. Article 4. This agreement comes into force immediately after signature and remains in force as long as the Tripartite Pact of 27th of September 1940. The signatory powers will confer in time before this period ends about the future form of the cooperation provided for in Article 3 of this agreement. Deputies, members of the German Reichstag, ever since my last peace proposal of July 1940 was rejected, we have realized that this struggle has to be fought out to its last implications. That the Anglo-Saxon Jewish capitalist world finds itself now in one and the same front with Bolshevism does not surprise us National Socialists. We have always found them in company. We have concluded this struggle successfully inside Germany and have destroyed our adversaries after 16 years' struggle for power. When 23 years ago I decided to enter political life and to lift this nation out of its decline, I was a nameless, unknown soldier. Many among you know how difficult were the first few years of this struggle. From the time when the movement consisted of 7 men until we took over power in January 1933, the path was so miraculous that only Providence itself, with its blessing, could have made this possible. Today, I am at the head of the strongest army in the world, the most gigantic air force, and of a proud navy. Behind and around me stands the party with which I became great, and which has become great through me. The enemies I see before me are the same enemies as 20 years ago. But the path along which I look forward cannot be compared with that on which I look back. The German people recognizes the decisive hour of its existence. Millions of soldiers do their duty. Millions of German peasants and workers, women and girls, produce bread for the home country and arms for the front. We are allied with strong peoples who, in the same need, are faced with the same enemies. The American president and his plutocratic clique have mocked us as the have-nots. That is true. But the have-nots will see to it that they are not robbed of the little they have. You, my fellow party members, know my unalterable determination to carry a fight once begun to its successful conclusion. You know my determination in such a struggle to be deterred by nothing, to break every resistance which must be broken. In September 1939, I assured you that neither force nor arms nor time would overcome Germany. I will assure my enemies that neither force of arms nor time nor any internal doubts can make us waver in the performance of our duty. When we think of the sacrifices of our soldiers, any sacrifice made by the home front is completely unimportant. When we think of those who in past centuries have fallen for the Reich, then we realize the greatness of our duty. But anybody who tries to evade this duty has no claim to be regarded in our midst as a fellow German. Just as we were unmercifully hard in our struggle for power, we shall be unmercifully hard in the struggle to maintain our nation. At a time when thousands of our best men are dying, nobody must expect to live who tries to depreciate the sacrifices made at the front. Immaterial under what camouflage he tries to disturb this German front, to undermine the resistance of our people, to weaken the authority of the regime, to sabotage the achievements of the home front. He shall die for it. But with the difference that this sacrifice brings the highest honor to the soldier at the front, whereas the other dies dishonored and disgraced. Our enemies must not deceive themselves. In the 2,000 years of German history known to us, our people have never been more united than today. The Lord of the universe has treated us so well in the past years that we bow in gratitude to a providence which has allowed us to be members of such a great nation. We thank him that we can also be entered with honor into the everlasting book of German history. Next speech. Mussolini's war statement on December 11th, 1941. This is another day of solemn decision in Italy's history and of memorable events destined to give a new course to the history of continents. The powers of the Steel Pact, Fascist Italy and Nationalist Socialist Germany, ever closely linked, Participate from today on the side of heroic Japan against the United States of America. The Tripartite Pact becomes a military alliance which draws around its colors 250 million men determined to do all in order to win. Neither the Axis nor Japan wanted an extension of the conflict. One man only, a real tyrannical democrat, through a series of infinite provocations betraying with a supreme fraud the population of his country, wanted the war and had prepared for it day by day with diabolical obstinacy. The formidable blows that on the immense Pacific expanse have been already inflicted on American forces show how well prepared are the soldiers of the Empire of the Rising Sun. I say to you, and you will understand, that it is a privilege to fight with them. Today, the Tripartite Pact, with the plenitude of its forces and its moral and material resources, is a formidable instrument for the war and a certainty for victory. Tomorrow, the Tripartite Pact will become an instrument of just peace between the peoples. Italians, once more arise and be worthy of this historical hour. We shall win. And we'll leave it there for this time. These are notable speeches from various of the Allied and Axis powers in the direct aftermath of the Pearl Harbor bombing. Of course, there were other powers involved, and although I did have a little look around on the internet and would be happy if you sent them to me, I couldn't find them too easily, and I think we'll leave it there at just shy of 2 hours. If you're not asleep by now, I don't think this kind of material is going to work for you, so maybe try some of my other materials. Some classic children's stories like Wind in the Willows, which I read chapter by chapter, or some Christmas tales, or even the entire Hardy Boys novel, The Mystery of Cabin Island, which was, I tell you now, quite a slog. If you have any suggestions as to other things you would like to hear narrated, or if you're just, liking the channel, or you want to reach out and tell me how your life's going in terms of sleep. I can tell you mine is quite sleepless, quite ironically, because we have, my wife and I, 2 young boys who are young enough that sleep is still a little bit of a challenge sometimes. And one of the greatest joys of starting this channel has been when we go to bed and having read them their bedtime stories and laying down with them, asking them the question, would you like to listen to boring Daddy? And the response being, yes please, Daddy. And if you're listening to this when you're a little older, boys, and you've figured out how to make YouTube work or whatever platform this is on by then I do hope you understand that reading to you has been one of the greatest joys of my life, and I will always enjoy reading to you, and I hope you get some education and interest and hopefully some pleasure from listening to me read these recordings. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of Fall Asleep Fast. If you like what you hear and you want to hear more of my voice, I'm sorry to ask again, but it would really help if you could subscribe by clicking that little button below. I'm sorry to bother you with all that. Talk to you next time. Sleep tight.